Okay, so thank you for being here. I would like to welcome Dr. Mervyn Brown. He has already made a few presentations in the previous years, very interesting ones, and we're lucky to have him over here because he's a very experienced man. As he will introduce himself,
I'm old.
Please go ahead and have a short introduction, and then we can start.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether this helps you or not, but I guess this is being recorded as well, so try to speak into the mic. Well, you heard my name. I'm a retired affiliate with University of California, Berkeley, classified as a senior advisor, so I still go to Berkeley every once in a while to advise. And originally I was the director of the electric grid research for the California Institute for Energy Environment, which is housed at UC Berkeley, but actually is an institute for all of the UC system throughout California. And I guess briefly my background, my degrees are in nuclear engineering. As a matter of fact, when I took this job with UC, I came from Colorado where I'd been with the National Renewable Energy Lab. I got a call saying that the UC had gotten a contract with the state to conduct research on the electric grid. This was following the blackouts of 2000, 2001 in California. So after much haggling, I took the job and came here. We had a board of directors made up of utility executives and California energy commissioners and PUC people and environmentalists, et cetera. So from my first meeting, I stood up and apologized and said, I have to confess, I'm a nuclear engineer and I never made it to the outer electron orbits, and now I'm trying to run an electric grid research program for you. And the other thing I did was I said, from where I stand and sit, your grid is in for some really big changes, and things will not be the way they were before. After having been in research and development for the electric and gas utilities for many years, my expected reaction out of this group was, oh, come on, we know how to run this thing. We don't need all this new stuff. It was the exact opposite. There were these vice presidents of the various utilities in the state saying, basically, how fast can you get this new technology to us? For a researcher, that would really warm my heart because someone actually wanted what I've been working on. So altogether, I've lost count, but between 45 and 50 years experience in the electric and gas utility business, working for electric and gas utilities. I spent a little bit of time working for an advanced nuclear research group down in San Diego. Got a little bit of chance to use my degrees there. And then also worked for a number of national labs. I've already mentioned the National Renewable Energy Lab. I'm going to Colorado for that. It was a Pacific Northwest National Lab. And and also for what it's worth, since we're in California here, I spent almost 10 years at Pacific Gas and Electric Company as head of their research and development, and also as their first business planner when competition came and they broke up into business units. And so that was a real change for me, going from research to a business planner. And so most of my work can be summarized as working as managing research. Didn't do a whole lot of it hands-on. I very quickly got into management early on. And also, as I mentioned, a brief stint being a business planner for PG&E. Before that, utilities didn't do business planning. They did generation planning, transmission planning, fuel procurement planning. They never did business planning. But when they became deregulated, they had to change. And this is sort of the message I'm going to be talking about today, the things that have taken place. I put this presentation, first let me ask this. How many people in the room are engineering students or faculty or working in engineering? Okay, how many in electrical engineering? Almost the same group. How many in power engineering? Wow, I should have asked that first. This is going to make this either simple or difficult because you should be able to follow what I'm saying. On the other hand, you'll probably find out how wrong I am in many cases. But the title on this slide at the moment is The Reasons We Want a Smarter Grid for the 21st Century. And I put this presentation together many, many years ago when the smart grid started to become a gleam in many people's eyes. And the one thing that caused me to do this was kind of use a generalization of Silicon Valley. I'm using that in a very broad sense. When about 6, 7, 8 years ago, firms from the Silicon Valley types got this idea that they could come solve the electric grid problems. And they very quickly zeroed in on digital meters at the customer's facilities and basically smartphone apps, if you will. And they saw this as the solution to the problem. I had been working in smart grid, we didn't call it then, clear back in the 80s. We started working on these technologies because we saw the time coming even back then. And something was gnawing at me. This really wasn't going to solve the problem, that they didn't have the answer. So I decided to put together a thought piece on why do we want a smart grid? And as I got into it, one, I found out that what I wanted to try to find out is what were the real reasons, because it turns out I don't think Silicon Valley had the real reason. And the other thing was, after I've studied this, it changed from a want to a must have. In other words, what I'm going to propose today is we don't have a choice. And I would say today, 6, 7 years ago, I think that was a question among even power engineers and utility people. I think today, this is not a question for them anymore. They very well know this is where we're going. So if nothing else for you who already have accepted this premise, this is a walk through history, how we got to where we are. And so to start off with, for most of us, and I say that in the people, particularly even outside this room, the electric grid is just wood poles and wires strung along our streets, or steel towers stretching across the fields and onto the horizon. And for most people, appearing deceptively static, technically simple, and at best, really not worth another thought. That is until the lights go out. And that's been happening more often recently again for a number of reasons, at least in California. Power outages, as I assume most in this room know, are expensive. We've had power outages that run up into many billions of dollars in lost economy. They're a threat to human health because humans depend on the electric grid in most societies around the world today, and also for their safety and their welfare. And it's also become a national security issue, particularly in the last few years. I might add as another background, I spent about 5 years recently serving on a federal committee that was created by the federal legislature to advise the Secretary of Energy on the electric grid and the kinds of new technologies that are going to be needed. And well, I was on that committee until Trump came to office, and then I got fired. But the thing that was coming forward in that committee meeting as we were studying this, and the committee was made up of some technical experts, I guess like I would fill that role, executives, CEOs from utilities and independent system operators, regulators, state legislators, consultants, firms that supply the utility industry, et cetera. That too made up this committee. And one thing that came forward in the last few years I was on it was national security. The grid was recognized more and more as a national security issue. So, so the 21st century grid faces new and unprecedented challenges that threaten to increase the risk of power outages and higher cost unless we modernize that electric grid. So that's a premise I hope to convince you of. But it's also important that the grid also has its hands full with a legacy of issues that came from the 20th century. And that's what I'm going to be focused on mostly, are those legacy issues, although I will touch on some of the 21st century issues. So hopefully this presentation will help you by providing a historical concept for the complex origin of these issues uh, that are creating these growing necessity for the new technologies for the electric grid, and the real reasons why the grid must be smarter for the 21st century. I had mentioned that sort of my experience with the Silicon Valley. Again, remember, I'm using that in a very broad sense of people who tried to bring the digital technology in to solve some of these problems. And I sort of took the position, they aren't stupid. Why did they take the path they did? What did they see that they thought was needed solving, and why did they think that would solve the problem? And I think there's an ancient metaphor for how we can get a complete understanding of the complex systems, such as the smarter grid. And that is the famous, kind of what you would call, just call it a metaphor or myth or story about the blind man and the elephant. And you may remember that story of when a blind man touched the trunk, he thought the elephant was a snake, touched the tail and thought the elephant was a rope, and so on, based on their limited perspective. And there was a poem written about this, and it goes like this: "And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceedingly stiff and strong. Though each was partly in the right, all were in the wrong." And that's what I think has happened with the electric grid. It's gotten considerably better, by the way. The blindfolds have been coming off, and we're starting to see the whole elephant. But I think that's why there are so many different versions of what the smart grid should be and what the problems are, what the issues look like. Is because of people were looking at it from their perspective, which was limited at that time. So there's different descriptions of the smarter grid, and the reasons for it led me to investigate the origins of what shaped the grid today and what will shape it tomorrow. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's kind of a long story. Most of it's true. I even lived a lot of it. I'm 75 years old. And so my story begins by examining past events and trends that forced the electric grid to change. And one of the big decisions that got made very early in the game, back in the late 1800s, was a result of a battle between Edison and Tesla. And you may recall Edison's approach to serving people with electricity was a DC system, very localized, where you build a generator in the community and ship the electrons to them in a very short path. Tesla instead was a more creative, innovative person. Well, that's not fair to say that. He was definitely a more scientific person than Edison. And he saw a different vision of the grid, which was based on new technology at the time, based upon basically transformers, for the lack of, that's kind of a metaphor or an example of that. So with this battle going on, if we look at Edison, he basically was an inventor and a businessman. He did perfect the light bulb, which created a huge market for electricity at that time. And he founded the Edison Illuminating Company and patented the DC system for electric distribution. So his real addition was the concept of a business of electricity. But Tesla was more of an inventor visionary. He invented the AC motor and transformer. He saw the future of the electric grid, and he enabled the AC grid to deliver Niagara power to New York. So the distinction was Edison was limited in his market. And by the way, if he'd done this maybe 40, 50 years later, when power electronics came along, he might have made it with DC, and we would have skipped all this AC stuff. But it was Tesla who pointed out to Westinghouse that we can get much cheaper power and deliver it over a much broader area by using high voltage AC systems. And again, I don't think I need to belabor it to this crowd why that got chosen, but the fact is it got chosen. And by the way, out of those efforts came two major companies. General Electric came out of Edison's work, and Westinghouse, well, it was there, but was aligned with Tesla. So Edison invented the electric business, but Tesla really sealed its future for good or bad. So Tesla's electric grid became the standard of the electric provider of the 21st century, or the 20th century. And so the traditional approach, starting in the 19th century, going on through most of the 20th century, was to build a kind of centralized power plant using high voltage transmission and lower voltage distribution to deliver electricity to the customer, who really was seen as a meter to measure how much electricity they used. That was about the only knowledge that the utility had of the customer. So the grid's role was the physical link for the generator to the meter, and it was under a regulatory compact. Now that in itself is another hour lecture. We're going to skip that one. The grid's operation was deterministic and planned. And this is an extremely important fact to understand. And the form was mostly radial, and it grew in size more than it did intelligence during this period. And this is another, to me, a critical factor, and comes from my business planning days at PG&E, is the grid's key success factor was reliability. This is what drove investment decisions, was reliability, getting reliable electricity to the customer. This is an important point, as we'll find out a little later. Now, if we look at what happened with demand, with price of electricity, despite the fact that demand over most of this time period grew at approximately 8% a year, today it's growing maybe 2%, in some places not even growing at all, maybe probably falling off in some areas, I'm not sure of that, but the average real price of electricity fell until about the 1970s. And if you want to create a business and your product keeps getting reduced in price, man, this is a way to create a lot of demand for it. Declining prices were due largely to the economies of scale in unit size, as larger new plants were built to meet the demand. So the message here, you build new technology and your unit cost goes down. So it seems to be a win-win. And I put together a simple equation. It's a thought equation. It's not a real mathematical equation, but it's written in mathematical terms. Looking at the items involved in the management decisions were very few, and the equation was extremely simple. It was a function of, we want to improve reliability. So the first question is, what's the next generator we're going to build, and how big can we build it? And then, oh, by the way, if we build a generator, we got to have some transmission and distribution to deliver that capacity. So success equaled reliability, and the big decision was largely the utilities to make alone, and it was choosing the next power plant. There was not much thought given to transmission distribution. It just came with the territory. So there's really only one decision, so to speak. But starting about the 1960s, and by the way, I'm skipping a lot of history where a lot of things happened, but I think for my case, the big things started to happen around the 1960s, which there were events and trends that set the stage for major change leading to the 21st century. By the end of the 20th century, the ways electric systems were planned, owned, built, operated, regulated, used, and bought and paid for would never be the same. So the first trend I want to talk about is the interconnection trend. And this came about, my metaphor for this is utilities started to be built in different places, power plants and their transmission and distribution systems were growing like mold on a piece of bread. And small regional electric utilities began to interconnect as the mold areas grew and bumped into one another. So they started to interconnect and say, hey, why don't we share our facilities? I think they did that mostly for reliability. They thought it was for reliability, but as we see in a moment, that had a double-edged sword to it. So in 1962, the Eastern Interconnection was formed. Eventually, there became 3 major interconnections in the United States, and most of you probably know what those are, so I won't take time on them right now. And that was fairly quickly followed by the Northeast Blackout of 1965, which most notably blacked out New York City. This was followed by the Electric Reliability Act of 1967 by the creation of North American Electric Reliability Council, NERC, in 1968 in response to this outage. So the implications of this trend are and were an unseen outage in a neighboring utility could cause a widespread blackout, putting your utility customers in the dark. So no longer could you just depend on your own ability to be a good operator and builder of an electric system. You were at the whims of those around you and how well they did their system, because if they didn't operate properly, they could put your customers in the dark. So the stage was set for increasing attention to formal operating standards for the grid. And this is one of the first big changes, in my opinion, to begin to set the stage for the modern electric grid. But regardless of these blackout threats, the trend persisted. The interconnections continued to grow and get more dense. And we'll come back to visit this in a minute, or not in a minute, but later in the talk. The next trend I want to talk about that was about the same time was the environmental trend that took place. And I picked as the poster child, so to speak, for this trend, Rachel Carson, who I say popularized ecology, the term and the meaning of ecology. In 62-63, she wrote The Silent Spring, which really was focused not on the electric grid, but on pesticides, DDT. And she testified in U.S. Senate attacking DDT in its industry. And at this time, she now had breast cancer and was dying. And she, I believe, believed, from what I've read, that it was DDT may have caused the breast cancer. But nonetheless, she was bringing this message to a lot of people. And although she was criticized, particularly by the chemical industry, she was essentially attacking, she prevailed. And so the implications are of her work and others like her, environmental impact became a factor in selecting, siting, and permitting new infrastructure for the electric grid, and generally extending construction schedules in the process. The external cost of environmental protection began to be internalized into the electric cost. An example was the 1970 Clean Air Act. I happened to be at Arizona Public Service Company right out of school, and they were one of the first ones hit by this. They had the Big Four Corners power plant that was putting out quite a bit of stuff. And it so happens, I believe it was in a Newsweek article, there was a high altitude photograph that showed a plume going off across the eastern United States. That caused a huge uproar. And the result was, after years of battle, the utility had to build a huge chemical plant on the back end of the coal plant that had never been built before to be able to remove the pollutants from that power plant. So here was an example of the first big change in the environmental movement, and there were many others that came at that same time or thereafter. Now, another trend that took place a little later on was what I call the fuel price volatility trend. There. For many years, much like the price of electricity, fuel prices were essentially flat and smooth, and maybe had a sort of a downward trend to it. So the utility didn't have to worry much about the cost of fuel in their planning of trying to run their business. But in the years 1970 to 2000, we saw huge volatility and price increases show up in fossil fuels. And in 73, the first oil embargo introduced in the United States, its first energy prices and fuel prices and its volatility increased rapidly. And this was a big shock to the utility industry and its customers. So the implications of this were the electric industry saw fuel price and resource uncertainties. Up till now, their life had been pretty deterministic. They were in control. Now there was a wild card in what they were doing. As we'll see, this trend is of having wild cards is going to grow. And the door opened to non-utility and alternative generation. It was about this time that they're starting to be thinking, maybe we can't depend on these large utilities anymore. We're going to have to try to get other players involved. And this led to what I call the alternative generation trend. You may know this happened mostly during the Carter administration. So in 1978, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA, passed. It forced utilities to contract with non-utility generators to buy electricity at avoided cost. I might add, again, I was in the industry at this time, the attitude of most of the executives in the utility industry is this would never work. You cannot have a third party own the generators and run an electric grid. This was all going to be doomed to failure. And it probably wouldn't amount to anything anyway, because who can build a power plant? Who can get the money to build a power plant if not a regulated utility? So an implication of PURPA was that it opened the electric grid for third-party owned generation, bringing into question eventually the natural monopoly paradigm. And it also encouraged grid-integrated renewable generations, partly because it was at the time when we were trying to figure out in this country how we're going to get by without oil, and or as much oil. Anyway, it encouraged grid-integrated renewable generation, wind farms, and distributed generation, such as mine heat power and microturbines. So this particular policy act, whether it was the right thing to do or not, in looking back, definitely opened the door to this concept. Another event that was about this same time and may have been caused by much the same events, although I'm not an economist, but I suspect that the increased prices of fuel as fast as it went up probably had an impact on interest rates. The point was, though, the facts were we experienced in this country and around the world for that matter very high interest rates. So in the 60s, 70s saw unprecedented rise in interest rates, in part causing $1 billion nuclear power plants to cost ultimately $5 billion. Now again, that's a broad brush oversimplification of all of this, but I do think these high interest rates had a big impact on changing the budgeted cost, which were typically around $1 billion, to end up being $5 billion before it was all said and done. So the implication is big power plant projects with long schedules now cost more, and the economy of scale had lost its punch, thus improving the competitiveness of smaller generation. And remember, this economy of scale was the big factor that allowed the electric industry to really grow and expand and add customers and consumption. And now this appears to have been turned upside down. So this led to, in part, the next event that I think I would argue is the largest or most impactful change that took place in this period. And there's only one that follows that I think is more impactful, and it's a toss-up, but it probably is. But there's this one. This reliability versus cost event. After 2 decades of falling prices, largely because of economy of scale, in the early 70s, the real price of electricity sharply increased. First of all, because of increased fuel prices, and then I think eventually because of increased plant costs. But the point was, at some point during this time period, reliability now came with a higher price for electricity. It used to be the utility would go to the regulator and said, guess what, I'm going to have to add another power plant. So I need to put more in capital and rate base. But the good news, it's going to lower the unit cost of electricity. That changed. Now the utility would come and say, I have to make an investment, and oh, by the way, we're going to have to increase the rate of electricity. So the cost is going to go up. This was a huge factor in the future of this industry. Tensions and rate increases grew among ratepayers, regulators, and utilities. One event that followed that was the broken regulatory compact. I didn't go into this in great detail, but I did point out that the early utilities were regulated. There was a compact established with society that says, so we don't have the building of unnecessary capital investment and putting high risk in this. You give me, the utility, the right to be the sole provider, to have a franchise in this area, and I will give you the right to regulate my profits and to set prices as long as I don't go out of business. An unwritten rule there. And I will provide power for the customers in this area. Well, what was happening at this time, customers did start complaining about higher rates. I remember when I was in the utility again, the executives would say, higher prices won't matter because the price of electricity is, I can't think of the word now, any economists out here? In other words, there's no limit in demand. There's a word for that, I can't remember it, I'm sorry. But anyway, customers would pay any price for electricity. They were wrong. Customers did complain, particularly industrial customers, about the higher rates, but even some of the residential complained, and this turned out to impact. So the growth in electricity actually began to fall off, which really surprised the industry that that would happen. Regulators threatened to or did disallow rate recovery for some large utility investments, with their power plants, gas contracts, the list goes on, that utilities invested thinking they had an agreement that they'd recover their capital and get earnings on it. Now the regulators come back and say that was a bad decision. We're second guessing you, and we're not going to allow you now to recover all these costs. That was a huge factor for CEOs of utilities because now their jobs were at risk. The shareholders, for those utilities who were shareholders, well, frankly, even if you're a municipality and this happens to you, then your owners are going to come back and say, what kind of stupid move was that? And fire them. And academics and policymakers began to talk about a new power system model based on competition, because imagine the dilemma in public hearings. Utility says I have to build more investment and raise the unit price in order to continue to serve electricity reliably. People come and says, but I don't want to pay more for it. And now there's a big argument goes on. How do you solve that problem? And it became more difficult for this problem to be solved than it matters. So some people said, why don't we let the market make that decision through competition and pricing? Which, by the way, at that time, utilities said, no way, we can't have competition in this industry. So the implications is utilities become adverse to making new investments and asking for rate increases because your past investments were now being disallowed. I remember I was at Arizona Public Search Company, I mentioned, at one time, and I remember our CEO went to the state legislature. I had left the utility, but I still paid attention, and basically said, we're not making any more investments in utility unless you pass laws to say we will get our earnings back, or our investment back in our earnings. So that was sort of an example of what was beginning to happen. And begin to see deregulation in the 1990s. Maybe this competition idea wasn't so bad after all. And so one of the trends we saw was this underinvestment trend in transmission, which went on for about 20 or 30 years. And so a new transmission investment went into a 25-year decline. Transmission capacity growth fell behind the rate of growth in demand. And the implications were daily transmission constraint, congestion to increase electricity costs, and the risk of blackouts. There was also underinvestment in distribution. And in that case, it generally showed up as complaints with higher rates and threats of competition led to cost cutting. And again, I was in utilities when this took place, and they started cutting the budget to replace wood poles and trim trees and all this stuff. So the implications were assets such as poles were used longer and longer, much beyond probably what they should have been because they would rot and fall down in winds, which we're kind of facing that problem today. And O&M, tree trimming was done less and less, and aging infrastructure and more storm outages were the result of this. I got more stories to tell, but I got to get on. I can't stop and just keep telling stories because, as I said, I lived most of this. That's probably why some of it's wrong, because it's my personal reflection. The deregulation trend then came out of this, also this time period. And in 1998, California established a wholesale power market, probably one of the first major ones in the United States. There was dramatic price increases and blackouts in California in 2000, 2001, rendered the deregulation attempt as a flawed grand experiment, which also, by the way, is when the legislature created this fund that got me lured away from Colorado to come to California to manage this fund to do the research on the electric grid in California. And despite this setback, a refined wholesale power market continued in California at the transmission level, and power markets eventually emerged in other parts of the U.S. I might add, retail markets did die under this experiment because it turns out someone had to go bankrupt in this system. And in the case of PG&E, they went bankrupt because they weren't allowed to pass on their higher cost of wholesale power. San Diego Gas and Electric in this experiment was allowed to pass on the cost to the retail customer. So now it was the dairy farmers and the McDonald's who were going bankrupt because they couldn't afford the huge increase in their power bills. So the implications are accommodating power markets has reduced the grid's ability to plan and add uncertainty in grid behavior, dramatically reducing the operator time and control for responding to problems. Another very insignificant event on how we manage and run a utility. And remember the interconnection trend I talked about, it happened back starting in 1962. That trend continued, and it became increasingly large interconnections to improve reliability and lower cost. And I think it was really now the latter that we formed these big things, not so much for reliability, but to lower cost. But it came at a price. The implications are, one, underinvestment in the transmission reduced the operating margins of safety. So we're operating these wires very close to their capacity. And sometimes power had to be constrained because you exceeded the capacity. Operators didn't have adequate real-time wide area situational information nor controls and the infrastructure to manage and plan with uncertainty. Remember, up to this time, the utility was large and in charge. They made the decisions which power plants got built, where the transmission lines went, who operated the power plants, when they operate them. Under markets, now markets determine that. And third parties came in and they were determined by what they bid into the marketplace. And now the operator didn't really know what was going to happen. And as Jim Detmers, who was a vice president until he left Cal ISO, he used to always say, my operators are operating blind. They do not know what's coming until it is there, because they don't have firm plans anymore about what to do. They have to rely on market prices. Local outages could and did cascade into massive widespread blackouts. And that did happen in the Western United States in 1996, which also launched a lot of efforts that I was involved in when I came here to California on research. And remember the smaller generator trend? Turns out there may have been some truth to that, more than just wishful thinking, or maybe there was a self-fulfilling prophecy. But changes in generation technologies improve the economies of scale for small unit sizes, largely due to moving from field-built direction, where huge capital costs and long periods of time were involved, like building a nuclear power plant. Now, people wanted to get in and get out fast, so they didn't build up large interest costs while they're putting these things in operation. They started to switch to factory-built systems, which produced cheaper generation, such as those based on turbines and reciprocating engines, as we'll see a little later on, based on silicon chips and wind turbines. The implications of generator ownership became more feasible for non-utilities and electric customers. Distribution was not designed for this trend, especially the potential for two-way power flow in the distribution system. By the way, the customer didn't sit still either during this time period. There were changes in the customer. Electricity customers changed too. Customers became more electrified. We switched more and more over to using electricity for things that used to use coal, oil, and coal and wood and stuff. The behavior of load became less resistive, inductive, and more electronic. This had a huge factor on predicting and planning the operation of the utility the next day, because the models didn't model the electronic behaviors of the customer. And some customers are now beginning to buy electric vehicles, which now means you have a load that moves around geographically. You don't know where it's going to be tomorrow or even this afternoon. And prosumers have electric generators or storage connected to the grid. So they're beginning to get involved in the generation. This is another huge subject we don't really have time to get into. Load behavior became more uncertain and modeling less accurate. We did a lot of research on this area, by the way. Customers are becoming less passive and more participatory in the grid. Grid, especially distribution, was not designed for this new customer. Now we have a second environmental trend coming about. This now coming up on us, and it's basically climate change, which is having a huge impact on this industry. Climate change mitigation is restricting the release of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, such as some insulating gases used in various protection systems. promoting electrification of transportation. And the implications are rapid, significant changes in electric generation resources to mitigate CO2 emissions, potentially large changes in electric consumption patterns, i.e. the electric vehicle as an example. The second environmental trend also brought climate change threats to the electric system security itself. Wildfires, droughts, large hurricanes, storms, etc. All these had impacts on the infrastructure, and as we're finding out, California is also having an impact on the finances of the utility when they're determined to be supposedly at fault for creating some of those fires under these conditions. Increased exposure of infrastructure to natural disasters is one implication, and changes in energy resource mix and consumption patterns. And then another one that's come about in recent years, and partly due to this climate change, is the electric grid resilience trend. Storms are beginning to have a lot more impact on the grid than they used to. That's part of the reason. Recent extreme weather events and other natural disasters threaten lives and cause great cost and are causing concern and attention to electric grid resiliency. On that federal committee that I was on, I mentioned that was another one of the things that came loomed large was resiliency, which was actually almost unheard of 10 years ago, wasn't talked about. New utility are being developed to prevent damage, recover quickly from damage, and try to survive at some basic level to keep some basic functions going during these times. And I'm not going into a lot of detail because of time limits. Okay, this is the other trend I mentioned when I talked about the trend of the flip-flop of the cost versus reliability was a big one. This is the other one I think is as big or bigger, and that's the renewable generation trend. We're seeing more of this around the world, particularly in California, of wind, geothermal, biomass, and solar. And of these, it's mostly fueled by variable wind and variable solar. I couldn't have picked two more difficult renewable resources to manage than those two. But they didn't pick them for that reason. Many variable renewable power plants have no inherent energy storage, a significant first for the electric grid. And by the way, I'd like to point that out. We often say the electric system has no energy storage, and that's just not true. It's always relied on energy storage, but it's always been at the factory where we produce the product. It's usually been fuel of some sort. And so the fact you now bring in a resource that doesn't have that built into it inherently changed things significantly. And then there's another form of inherent storage I'm going to talk about in a minute. So traditional thermal and hydro power plants have built-in energy storage in the fuel or the ponded water. The power grid is designed and operated under the influence of inherent inertia, which is another form of energy storage, and the rotational mass of the turbine generators in the traditional thermal hydro power plants. But wind and solar plants, at least some solar, most today, plants using electronic power conversion have little or no fuel storage or no inertia. This lack of inherent energy storage feature is unprecedented, I already mentioned that, in the electric grid. To grid owners and operators, the renewable generation looks more like this. Popular, probably the herding cats. And some of the reasons are because the variable renewable generators exhibit these unique features for which T&D weren't designed. Variable and unpredictable fuel availability, unprecedented fast power ramps, generation oversupply, which actually isn't inherent in renewables. It's inherent in the policy that we put in place to encourage renewable. Decreased frequency response, low inertia, and new locations. In other words, remote transmission, because now the power plants are have to go where there is the resource, and also a lot of them are being built where the customers are, and this is all new in the way of the electric grid. They don't normally have the capacity to take electricity at that point. And by the way, in a follow-on talk to this one that I gave last year here, I talk a lot more about this problem. This is causing great uncertainty for T&D owners and operators and concerns about reduced reliability, safety, power quality, and higher costs. So renewables integration is a major new challenge for the 21st century electric grid. And the way this has evolved is basically renewables integration is asking the grid for help in coming into its own. It relies on the grid, or almost nearly 100%, not totally. there are some off-grid applications. But it's important to remember that the grid also have its hands full and with legacy issues that I've talked about in the 20th century. So we have a grid come limping into the 21st century, and all of a sudden got a huge barrier thrown in its way. So for most of the 20th century, electric grid had a relatively simple role moving electricity from central power plants to the ratepayers. This behavior was predictable. The operation was largely deterministic, and an operator was in control. But the 21st century electric grid faces a growing tension between reliability and cost. Aged, underbuilt infrastructure strained to the limits. New infrastructure increasingly difficult to size and permit, particularly transmission, by the way. Inadequate situational visibility of grid for the operators. The threat of extremely costly and disruptive widespread blackouts and increased enforcement of electric standards. Remember back after the blackout in the Northeast in the early mid-60s, when they put in place some standards. Today, those have come with huge cost involved. If the utility or the system operator doesn't follow the standard, they can be millions of dollars a day, I'm told, in penalties. It isn't cheap. Accommodating the uncertainty of electric markets in planning and operation and a growing and changing electric customer base, which is another big topic to deal with. We do not have markets yet that really can fully handle the future. And combined with public policy pressures concerning environmental impacts and regulations and the high use of renewable generation, which I'm missing. And another big one nowadays is protecting grid security and customer privacy. It's fairly a latecomer on this list. I didn't talk much about it. I will, if we have time, touch on it later. So the result is growing uncertainty, complexity, inadequacy, conflict, and the need for flexibility, robustness, real-time situational awareness, probabilistic forecasting, and rapid response. That's where we're at today. So if you want to look at, remember that equation I showed you that was very simple? This is probably what today's, for the 21st century equation looks like. And I won't go into all of the details, but these are now all of the different options that the decision makers have to look at to know where to invest. And it's extremely very complex, and it's now gone from being deterministic, where you chose the power plant and everything else followed. Now it's very complicated. I mean, one decision affects the other. It's very interactive, nonlinear. So this has become an extremely complex thing. There are now many players, including customers, who are now involved in this, in making these decisions. And this is requiring unprecedented smarts to both plan them and, as we'll find, to see will operate them. So the assertion out of all of this, and I'm not sure, at the time I put this in, this was debatable, but I don't think it is today. Perhaps we can build our way out of these problems, but soon, and I think we'll pass soon, traditional build solutions, that is investment in traditional wires, towers, and power plants, can't do it alone. New technology will be needed to make planning, siting, building, and operating easier and less costly. Especially technologies that make the grid smarter. Now, remember the blind man and the elephant, okay? Now perhaps we can see the elephant more clearly as a whole unit, and what is that, the smart grid elephant? And if form is to correctly follow function, I think it does matter that the smarter grid take it in its historical complexity, so that we understand what's behind all these decisions and why it is so complex, and why we should be careful how we characterize that elephant. And a few cautions follow in the next slide about the smart grid. One of them is just what is the smarter grid, which is a more popular, better phrase for me, because the smart grid implies there's a finished product out there. I don't know if we know there is a finished product for a smart grid, but certainly there are smarter grids. They're really the joining of two infrastructures, the more traditional electric infrastructure and the intelligence infrastructure, which bringing in mostly new technology in the form of electronics, power electronics, communications, computers, etc. And they've been merged together more and more. Now, one of the things that I mentioned right up front was this digital meter, and some people jumped on that and saying that was the smart grid. We put the digital meter in, customer, and we now have a smart grid. No, it's not enough. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient by a long shot. So what's really needed is while the focus has been on the smart meter, smarts must be applied throughout the electric value chain. Today, this is not so much a question, it's happening a lot. But 5 or 6 years ago, I don't think that was the case. The thing was on the smart meter, and I thought there was too much attention being applied to that. I was once asked at an investment conference about that time, about investment in the smart meter, and the investors were all hot on this. They were going to make billions of money off of these things. And I stood up and burst their bubble, and I was kind of booed out of the room. I said, look, you're going to be putting these things in, but they're going to be like the early PCs. They're going to cost a lot more than what they're worth. The early PCs got brought in as overpriced word processors. But eventually, when they brought in networking and applications, they became completely embedded in the business structures. I think the same thing will be true of the digital meter. We're beginning now to get to that point. But what I was basically telling you, about 5 to 10 years too early in the investments, in my opinion. But go ahead and do it, because it'll turn out to be a real boom to this industry down the road. But you probably won't make a lot of money on it up front. Automation is a natural for the smarter grid. But there's two questions. Should the human operators babysit the automation, or should automation babysit the human operators? And this is a big question today, particularly with the Boeing 737 MAX. In the aero industry, they tend to take the first one. The human operators babysit the system, but the automated system flies the airplane. There are some good things about that, but there's also some bad things. One, the human operator doesn't get daily experience in operating that thing, and therefore get the, if you will, the muscle memory going. Secondly, well, they also tend to fall asleep. It's not necessarily literally, but figuratively. And also, when things do go wrong, they've got to operate very fast and all of a sudden wake up, so to speak, and take action. And we're beginning now to see what may be some of the issues with that. The other one is instead the operator flies the airplane, but the automated system is there as the backup if things go wrong and take over as a last-ditch effort to save the device. So which one should the electric grid use? I think there's an argument for number two, but there's an issue with that. Unlike, I think, an airplane, and I'm not an aerospace engineer, so I'm not totally sure of this, but I would argue the grid is much faster acting than an airplane. And therefore, automation is going to mean a lot more benefit to the electric grid than it does to an airplane. So if you rule out number one, you're going to lose a lot of the advantages of automation, because your human's going to be involved in the first decisions. So I think it's a tough one to decide. Let's put it this way. The way we're heading now is grid operators do not want to give up control of the grid. And so automation is going mostly down the path, with the exception, I'd say, of protection. Down the path of automation is the babysitter. But I think it's a question that needs to be addressed. And then another one, only reason I point this out, and I'm just going to go through this in a hurry, is that most of the disruptions that the utility faces, particularly in the past, were natural events that were either low impact but high frequency, or they were very rare and just didn't happen if they were major. And so this is the kind of thing that the utility came to deal with. But today, there's a growing one, particularly in other countries, but our country is vulnerable too. Is terrorism and vandalism are a growing organized threat to unit security. There's the assault on physical assets, and there was a famous one a while back when a PG&E substation got shot up. And by the way, I'm told that's not uncommon. I've talked to many utility executives that they have a lot of damage from people shooting up their equipment, and it can cause huge fires, and does cause fires. Anyway, the other one is the cybersecurity electronic targets, and this is a growing one that's getting bigger and bigger of an issue, and there's some interesting stories to tell about that, but I don't think we have time. So cybersecurity is uniquely a factor of the smarter grid. And the Internet of Things is especially worse. And at one of our federal committee meetings, we had a person from Google show up, and his words to us: do not allow the Internet of Things into your grid. You cannot protect them from cybersecurity issues. So I thought that was astounding from that person. That we kind of concluded that was a major problem, because imagine your refrigerator is connected to the grid and you have to upgrade it once every 6 months, and it costs maybe $500 to do that. For too long, you're buying a new refrigerator. So there's not much hope you're going to have a lot of security on that end of the grid. And there's even question marks deeper into the grid. But anyway, so the Internet of Things is something to watch for. Now, there's also another caution I want to throw in about going to the smart grid. And it's what I call: we must avoid creating an inverse Frankenstein monster from a smart grid. By that I mean, to be useful, even superb knowledge must be actionable. And to be superbly actionable requires a superb physique. And so the point is, the physical electric infrastructure of the 21st century also needs new technology and assets in order to be able to handle what's changing in the smart area. So last slide. The smarter grid is not an option. It's a necessary, if not sufficient, investment for keeping the lights on, electricity prices in check for the 21st century. And this is just a thought teaser. Has a century of changes brought us full circle? Remember the battle between DC and AC. And the question is, Edison DC grid might be being revived for a new technology area in the 21st century electric grid, in part brought about and enabled by the very smart technologies that I've been talking about. So that's it. Thank you. If we have time and if there are any questions, I'm free to ask. No questions? Oh, one back there. Thank you.
So for one of our classes that we have is global energy classes, and we discussed why don't we even most devices that we have in our household are DC systems. They require DC power. We have to invert them from AC power to DC. Wouldn't it be better for us to, like, if we're going to change our infrastructure, change to more small scale DC generation with like solar and wind power systems?
The answer is maybe. Yeah, by the way, the question was, with more and more basically photovoltaic systems being put, say, on residential roofs, they produce DC power, and then we go to the cost and the energy inefficiency, but then convert it to AC so it can operate our AC appliances and go out onto the grid. The answer is, why don't we just convert to DC for the load system as well? And the answer is, you can. There's a bit of a practical matter right now. You can get devices that operate on DC. RV systems do it all the time, and so you can essentially put a house on DC systems. So the answer is you can. If you want to, though, put power back onto the grid, then now you're going to have to convert to an AC system, because that's the grid. Maybe down the road, as I implied, we may switch to DC systems, but that's going to be a big, big challenge, because we got this huge inertia out there, so to speak, with the existing system and the infrastructure that goes with it. And all of it, by the way, the bigger issue, frankly, is regulation and policies. So I can't really answer your question, but let me put it this way. There are a lot of people who are with you. It says that maybe for some particularly larger facilities, like some of the electronic facilities at southern factories, to stay with the DC system. As you probably know, being in this field, though, there are some challenges with DC transmission and switching and changing voltage. But again, it's easier today with power electronics than it certainly was 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but let's put it this way. You're definitely on the frontier of change that's being looked at, and it could very well happen. I guess you were in you. Okay.
So I heard of like in several countries, especially like the most recent one is in China, where they constructing or probably finished construction of the ultra high voltage line DC transmission.
Did you say DC or AC?
Yeah, DC.
DC, yeah.
It's like over like 1200 volts DC.
Yeah, I think
So,
so.
so is that where the trend is going to be from AC or?
But see, you two just raised the dilemma we're in right now. Which way are we going to go? Are we going to go more centralized? Are we going to go send power further away? By the way, I'm sorry. The question was in China, they probably have finished by now building a huge, very high voltage DC transmission system. More and more of those systems are being used to connect large renewable plants to the grid. And here again, new technologies are making that DC technology a whole lot more compatible with the AC system than it used to be. It used to be you had to have huge, big systems to monetize, I can't think of the word again, but to be able to afford to pay for the conversion technology from DC to AC to interface with an existing AC grid. That's changing. Cheaper technologies are becoming available, and so we're seeing a lot more DC brought in. So is that the trend? I think it's an interesting question. There's some, number one, that trend lends itself towards a large national grid, heading in that direction, which some people are proposing, like one large internet system. There are some problems with that because in some way there's an argument for going the other direction, for breaking the AC grid up into a lot smaller pieces where you can monitor the interactions between these divisions, because remember, a blackout up in British Columbia can black out the whole western United States the way it's designed now. If you broke these things up, let's say AC, DC, AC interfaces, you would then have a protection system that would isolate systems from that kind of thing. And indeed, your DC systems then would make the national grid a more likely kind of thing. And so, and the beauty of a national approach is, if we were to plaster the western United States with photovoltaics, and by the way, it wouldn't really require that much area to get enough electricity. Energy, power is a different issue, by the way, capacity. Then it would be ideal to be able to ship this stuff all around, and wind in the Middle Plains area, et cetera. But on the other hand, you can also get this stuff locally. You don't have to worry about the large system, et cetera. If you want my own foolish prediction of what's going to happen, I think we're going to see more and more growth at the distribution level. And what we're going to see, though, is so much extra generation at times that they're going to want to get into the market and sell it across the United States, or at least across the western United States too. And so, in fact, I stood up at a CEC meeting that was arguing we do not need to build as much transmission we used to, because all this distributed generation is reducing that. I caution that I think that's a very fleeting instant, because I think we're going to find ourselves with so much photovoltaic generation down in the LA Basin that on a very cool spring day, they're going to want to ship that power back out into Nevada or Arizona, et cetera. So you're going to need the transmission system again. So it's a complex world, and I can't really answer your question, but there's certainly a move in that direction, and there's advantages to it. And you had a question.
Kind of explain as well with the day 2045 for California, so renewable energy. Is that like a smart choice, like a realistic choice, knowing that you basically push so much cost for the power companies? And is it rather to let that to the customers and let the market grow itself and change itself to that?
So if I had your question, you're talking about essentially legislative and regulatory mandates to go to much higher penetrations of renewable generation in California's grid. And is that the right or smart thing to do? Depends on your objective. If you're trying to mitigate CO2 production and you want to switch to electric transportation, then certainly it makes a lot of sense to encourage that form of generation. But in the talk that I give following this, and I raise a lot of your concerns, is every time you increase the penetration of this variable generation resource, you increase the difficulty of maintaining the grid, keeping it operating, keeping it economical, particularly since it's an AC grid, which is another reason they do DC. AC grid suffers a lot from these generation resources. So I guess if I were asked that question by a legislator, I would say, I understand your enthusiasm for wanting to push for this technology, and indeed you ought to do that, but you ought to do it by serious, deep discussion with the people who are going to have to deliver this electricity at various places and find out what's really involved. Because I think right now our regulation is driving faster than its headlights. I'm concerned that down the road a problem's going to show up. Say a widespread blackout that someone's going to point to and say it was this photovoltaic power plant that caused it. Because we can do that nowadays with single phaser technology. And that could cause a backlash. People say, well, wait a minute, no, I don't want these blackouts if that's what's going on. Then we have a reverse going on. Now we're going to have to fight to keep pushing the renewable generation. And I think that would also be bad. So I'm going to say something that's just personal, but I sit in meetings that are public, and the executives of many of the utilities and the ISO show up, and they basically said, we can do it, we can do it. It's going to hurt, but we can do it. So yeah, keep doing it. I talk to the people within these organizations, that's a different story. The people who have to actually operate the grid, I see fear. I hear fear. They say every day is a challenge for keeping the grid up and operating, and because of the variable renewable generation. And I think there's a mismatch then in the message that's getting out to the public and to public decision makers. And I think there needs to be more careful vetting of this. And it is kind of happening. For example, the PUC has begun to look at some of these entities that were formed, like the clean, the community, what's it called? The community, CAA? CA. Yeah, community choice aggregate. They're beginning now to get big and have an impact. And they're trying, most of them are trying to go 100% renewables. The CPUC is starting to point out, well, wait a minute, you're a free rider on this system. And you're potentially causing trouble, and you're definitely causing cost. And so something's got to change. So I'm beginning to see some understanding of the problem you're raising and whether we can do it. Now, the question is, can we go 100%? I think the answer is probably yes, if you have the right technologies and the right plan. Obviously, you get lots of storage. Now, whether you can afford it, I don't know. And then it's relative, what can you afford? If the other choice is climate change and the damage that comes with it, that could cost a whole lot more. And how do we make that decision when we don't know what that cost is in either case? So again, it's not one of these tough questions. I guess we just keep going. But one time on this committee I was on, we had a commissioner from the PUC come out, and this was right after they had passed that ruling saying that the utilities, the regulated utilities, were going to have to buy so much energy storage. Just buy it. And there were a lot of people, including myself, that said, what are you going to do with it? Don't you have to have a reason for it before you buy it? There was a function for it. And when this woman came out to our committee, the federal committee, and testified on what they were doing, she basically admitted they knew that they were pushing the envelope, but they felt they needed to get the storage out there, getting used to it, starting to create markets for it, and have to be prepared to handle whatever challenges it brought. And she felt that the challenges in terms of cost would probably be relatively small at the level they were talking about. But I was impressed that this regulator came out and said, yeah, we did this knowingly. I expected her to say, oh, I don't believe it. I don't agree with that. Instead, she said, yeah, we knew we were pushing the envelope. So there's some hope that people involved in these decision makers do understand what's going on. Any other question? Back there, yes, Richard.
It was mentioned in the lecture that the load became more resistive than inductive. and became less resistant and inductive and more electronic. Could you elaborate on what electronic means?
Yeah. First of all, it's maybe I'm telling you what you already know, but the resistive and the inductive was that for many decades, most of the load could be characterized in a Kirchhoff's law diagram as either resistive or an inductive. And models were developed, and then bringing in data on forecasting of weather, the utility was able to forecast what the load was going to be the next day, and also the dynamic behavior of the grid of the if things went wrong, if there were interruptions, transients. They could predict what the grid was going to do using those models. Power electronics are now coming about. They're showing up in our lighting systems. Many of our motors now have power electronic controls on them. My well pump at my place, I have a little ranch up there. It's now electronically, and we've got generators that are electronically connected to the grid. The electric car is going to be that kind of thing. All the computers and all the other kinds of those kinds of technologies, even in your own refrigerator stuff, all will now contain that kind of behavior. I'm told that that behavior is becoming enough of a factor, and the fact you can't model it in the Kirchhoff's diagram, that there's the concern. I do kind of have a belief, maybe because this is what we were working on at Berkeley when I retired, is developing a distribution synchrophaser, which now is developed, by the way, and is now being sold. The applications are still being worked on. With that kind of technology, maybe you don't need to model the distribution system anymore, you can measure it. And now you would have instantaneous measure about what's happening. Now that gives you data to begin to develop, as I mentioned earlier, probabilistic forecasting type models based upon stochastic data. I think that's the future. I think the idea of using simple line diagram models is going away because the grid's getting too complicated. Who am I to know? I'm not that skilled in this area, but this is just what I see going on. But that's what I meant by the electronic load. And the other problem I'm told is every manufacturer's electronic component behaves differently. I mean, a resistor behaves like a resistor. The electronic circuit board doesn't. They're all different. So they can't use a model for one inverter to do it for another inverter. And that's why I think we're going to be going to more measurement of the systems. And it probably won't be total measurement because that's overwhelming. It'll probably, as I said, models based upon neural networks, stochastic data, and things like that, where you're constantly learning the model. You're changing the model as the load changes. So it may work for a few weeks or a few months or even a few years, but then you're constantly updating them with the data you get. That's what I think part of the real future is.
Okay, so let's give another hand. Thank you very much for the inspirational talk. So obviously, as what I see here, is we have a lot of work to do in the future, and you as the young generation of engineers, don't worry about the job market. So there's a lot to do.
It depends.
Yes.
A lot of the things that you mentioned are driven by policies and political. So it all depends.
On that federal committee I was on, almost invariably, when we look at all these different problems, it would boil down to the technology is not that tough, really. We can do it. It may cost. But the problem is that our institutional infrastructure can't let you do it. It's a barrier. It's in the way. So invariably, our advice to the DOE, Department of Energy, was do research on figuring out what impact institutional policies have on the technology needs and what can technology impacts have on the changes in the institution. So DOE had to walk a very fine line. They can't go out and do research on policy. They can't per se, and they can't advocate policy. It's against the law for them. But what they can do is take a scientific approach and say, how is institutional policy affecting the need for technology and eliminating other technologies in the process? And vice versa, how could technologies affect policy decisions? Like, should we have markets? So it's a very good question, a very good point, because I don't know how often the frustration comes about when you get this new neat technology and you find you can't use it because it doesn't fit. Storage is a prime example of that right now. Markets aren't designed to handle storage. So storage, people who try to get into the business of power markets are at a disadvantage. The system's not designed for them. And so the disadvantage is economical. They can't take advantage of all their assets that they have. And markets are institutional, they're hard to change. But there's also other regulations, and such as standards, the safety standards and those kinds of things, performance standards. Some of those are new products. They don't have a place to go, and they don't have certification for them. And it's very slow process. It's human. And I don't know what we're going to do about it. As many times, if we're going to have failure here, that's probably where it's going to be, is in the institutional. It's us. We met the enemy, and it's us. But that doesn't mean that we don't need people working on the technologies. We do. There's still a lot that needs to be done, and it's just going to be frustrating. And for most of you that go in the technology field, at least in this business, but I suspect it's in the same way. That's probably going to be a place of frustration for you, as you say, I know this technology will work. I know what it can do, but no one will trust me. I remember I was working, again, I was head of this research program that was funded by the state and working out of UC. And we'd have regular meetings where we'd bring together, I'll call them loosely the grid people, with researchers. And we would discuss these problems. And one of them we were discussing that day was the low frequency oscillations in the Western electric grid, which supposedly is what really caused the outage in 1996. But to me, it's all fascinating stories, and I tell some of them in my next research. But so we were meeting up at Bonneville Power, and we were in a meeting room right next to the operating room. And we were discussing about using synchrophasor technology for automated control of the grid. And here we're talking about really flying the airplane. We're not talking about a protection system that only has one choice, either turn it on or turn it off. This was a feedback loop system in which you would come in, come off, and change magnitudes, etc. And about whether you could do it, whether you wanted to do it, whether you needed to do it. So a few of us stepped out for a bathroom break, and a grid operator came out of the closed locked doors. So we cornered him in the hallway and asked him if he knew about this synchrophasor technology. Well, yeah, being at Bonneville, that's one of the places that got first invented, so to speak. He knew about it, and his answer was, I ain't gonna allow no fuzzy logic in my control room. Because we're talking about parametric type systems here. We're not talking about deterministic. We're not talking about simple measurements and then turning a switch or a dial or something. And it requires things like fuzzy logic and forecasting, and it's probabilistic. So there's an 85% chance now that the system, the thing you just took, the actor just took, might work. That means 15% it won't work. So they don't like that. Though they really operated under that, they didn't see it that way. They saw it as deterministic. I made this decision, it's going to work. So if it doesn't, then I meant something else was wrong. But anyway, yes, I thought that was a very good case in point of what you're up against institutionally. The operators, and I think they're getting much better at this with these new technologies coming in, but because they are happening.
Okay.
So I think if there are any more questions, we can do it after. We need to go to the room at 30, so.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for your patience.